Welcome back, everyone. So, Clement, I will tell you that the group here is about 28 law students. And then we open these sessions up also to the public, the well-meaning public that want to participate and learn. And so we've got a nice group of wonderful folks joining us, some of whom join us every week and others who dial in just because this is a particular topic of their interest. So thank you for coming to speak to us as part of our Frontlines of Gender Justice series, as you so graciously acknowledged. For those of you who don't know Clement, he is the Associate Director and the head of the Immigrant Legal Services at the Sex Workers Project, a project at the Urban Justice Center that does really incredible work and has for quite a long time. Clement was also at Immigration Equality before being at the Sex Workers Project, and Immigration Equality is also a wonderful organization that has for a number of years provided dedicated immigration legal services to the LGBT community, and was really the only game in town for quite a long time. There are other organizations that have now moved into that space, but Immigration Equality was really the first. So Clement, what I thought we would do is you and I have a little bit of a conversation with a few questions, and then I'll pass it off to a couple of other folks who've volunteered to take some responsibility for the questioning today, and then we'll open it up. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about the Sex Workers Project, what you do, what the mission is, how big the staff is, what the work looks like?
Sure, absolutely. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for having me, folks. My name is Clement Lee. I'm an attorney at the Sex Workers Project. A lot of people call me Clem. You can call me Clem. The Sex Workers Project is a nonprofit organization that provides free legal services to people impacted by sex work. Really simply, I consider myself a deportation defense attorney. Folks that have really complicated criminal histories because of their involvement in sex work and are at risk of deportation or are undocumented and they're blocked from getting lawful permanent resident status or citizenship. Those are the part and parcel of what I do there. The kind of work that we do there is sort of a holistic sort of approach. We try to make sure that folks are connected to, safety net services, are connected to the legal counsel, and are able to participate in sort of the sex work that they want if they do it by choice, and sort of escape it and leave if they do it by coercion. I always start off every conversation about sex work just using those words. I think it's really important that when starting any conversation about sex work to recognize that we have folks that do it by choice, we have folks that do it by circumstance, we have folks that do it by coercion. So choice, a lot of folks find sex work fulfilling, right? It's a way to supplement income, and it's a way to sort of make sure that you have income to sort of supplant whatever work you're also doing. We have folks that do it by circumstance. So we have a lot of undocumented folks that are sort of pushed to the fringes of the formal economy, and they do it because of circumstance. It's something that there's not many options. There's not many safety net options available to them, and they sort of do that. We have folks that do it by coercion, right? I was talking with Abby, somebody I work with earlier today, and we have this one client where the thing, she was trafficked, she was locked in a room, she was forced to do commercial sex against her will. But the thing that bothers her the most is the fact that there exists Polaroids of her being forced to do commercial sex against her will. She's mortified, she's terrified when talking about it. She hates that those exist in the world. But, and we have other clients that have like content on OnlyFans, a site that's for subscription that a lot of folks do sex work on. And so when you compare those two things, they're sort of, the substantive thing there is the same, but the agency is different. So I sort of like to begin any conversation about sex work with that, but I'll let you guide the conversation the way you want, Professor Franke.
Okay. So there's the immigrant defense work that you do, the sort of deportation defense work, and then kind of map out what the other work is that other people at the Sex Workers Project are doing.
Sure. So for the deportation defense, we make sure that folks that are undocumented and would like to present claims to present their status, that they're connected to it, whether it's asylum or T visas, which are visas available for people who have survived trafficking. We also do policy work. There are various bills that are sort of in play now that move towards decriminalization of sex work. That's sort of the ultimate goal of our organization, making sure that folks that want to do sex work are not criminalized for it. And we also do education. I think that in recent years, this topic of sex work is something that, a lot of folks that are policymakers would have been like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But the fact that, these have to do with issues of autonomy and issues that like sex work is work, these are things that people are more willing to listen to now than in the past. So we mostly do deportation defense. We mostly do education and policy work, and, connecting clients to help they need. We also work with legal aid. A lot of our folks have criminal convictions related to sex work that have to do with being trafficked, and under New York law, we're allowed to vacate those convictions. And a lot of times that helps folks if they're trying to get immigration status, but it's also a human dignity thing, right? If somebody has been trafficked and, they have a rap sheet and it comes up with these convictions, vacating it helps folks feel like they closed a chapter in their lives and sort of reclaim some human dignity. So that's like a sort of umbrella description of what we do. Okay.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about whether you've seen any changes, maybe it's too soon, since January 20th, in the way that the deportation cases are being handled by the federal government.
Yeah. So I would say that the biggest change that I've seen immediately is the reduction in fear amongst my immigrant clients. It used to be like when the Trump administration sort of started, I was having conversations with like, should I make a place to hide at work in case there is a raid? Do I need to make plans to make sure that my children are taken care of in case I'm deported? Every sort of decision had to do with this sort of amorphous fear. And I think that, as an attorney, one of the jobs that I think is my primary responsibility is to sort of take fear and quantify it and sort of make it make sense to the client. And that has been really difficult during the Trump administration, when it seems like the purpose of the administration is to create fear and create it in this sort of amorphous, vague way just to make everyone afraid. Now, I had an asylum interview last week. When I told the client, you have your asylum interview today. I don't know if you're going to win. I can't guarantee it, of course, but I do think you have a strong case, and I do think you have a fair shot at it. So that is a sort of fear-based change that I have noticed immediately. There have been sort of like in this rush of policy changes. So the Trump administration put together like many different legal memos, some changing big policies, some changing small policies. Like a small policy example is like, if you have an immigration form and it's a blank space and you don't write NA on it, they could reject it. And that would add 3 or 5 months to your application, which just seems like part and parcel of this like larger policy just to like make immigrants not be able to get benefits. That's sort of gone away. And there's a lot of things like that that won't make big headlines that sort of have made a big difference in my clients' lives. Another one is, it used to be if you put it in an application for a T visa, that's a visa available for folks who have survived trafficking. If you lost that, the Trump administration could put you into removal proceedings to be removed from the United States. So, you know, that's a gigantic amount of fear that goes into the calculus of deciding whether or not you want to apply for this. I mean, remember, for these sorts of cases, these folks are digging into like the worst parts of their lives, like to even draw up these folks' stories and put it in an affidavit form involves like really intense cultural competence or counseling, and, you know, negotiating folks as they experience hyperarousal, fear, PTSD type things. When you add on, and plus you can get deported if this is not approved, it makes folks shut down. So the fact that we have now, that memo has been rescinded, the fact that folks can just sort of apply makes I'll say it again, it's the fear that has gone down. There's a lot of like talk on the horizon of, you know, there's going to be a bill that provides the route to citizenship in sort of 8 years. I'm cautiously optimistic about that. There was a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform back in 2013 that sort of died in Congress. And so I am being cautiously optimistic about it. But I am, one of the things that I like is that we're going back and calling all the people that were too scared to apply within the past 4 years and trying to put forth claims now. So those are sorts of things that I've noticed immediately, and I'm sort of optimistic cautiously that things will change for the better going forward.
It's interesting that last comment of yours is consonant with what I wanted to ask you next, which is, to what degree was the fear that was intentionally created by the federal government as a matter of policy something that could be exploited by traffickers or others that would render the work, whether it was trafficked work or other more vulnerable work, all the more dangerous?
Right. To a large extent. One of the classic patterns that we see in our trafficking cases, in our sex trafficking cases, is that the trafficker will create a sort of climate of fear. You see this a lot with our transgender cases, where folks are terrified of being removed to a country where they face persecution. The trafficker will like take the person's identity documents, whether they be passport or, you know, a consular ID, and sort of threaten, you know, if you don't do exactly as I say, you know, I'm going to report you to immigration. For someone who doesn't know the system at all, and all they see is sort of these, you know, these statements full of animus from the administration, that carries a lot of weight. And so, yes, I like see that a lot, that these traffickers can use that as a threat against folks. So, you know, I would say that you know, traffickers will continue to do that, but I think that over the past 4 years, it's been particularly salient.
What's the current status on ICE raids in New York City, in our 5 boroughs? We're supposed to be a sanctuary city. Yeah.
So a sanctuary city means that the government of New York City won't actively cooperate with the federal government in assisting in immigration enforcement. But, you know, in this federalist sort of form of government that we have, the federal government can sort of just step in and say, I don't care about you, local government, cooperate or don't cooperate, but this is the thing that we're doing. We do see, so the kinds of raids that we see nowadays, we see a lot of raids in sort of Flushing and Queens. There's a lot of the Asian massage parlors. The way that those situations sort of work is that it begins with a lie, right? We see a lot of folks from Korea. We see folks from China, where you know, the snake heads, the smugglers will say, oh, if you pay this amount of money, we can get you to the United States and give you employment, whether it's waitressing or working in a bar or something like that. And then what happens is they're kept in sort of debt bondage, right? Like the amount of money that they owe keeps going up. And the work that they do ends up being in a massage parlor and being commercial sex against their will. So we do see raids there. We also see some raids. So we have other folks that are sometimes caught up in Central American sex trafficking rings, where folks, usually young women, are sort of duped into coming to the United States with somebody who has groomed them, somebody who has said, come to the United States, we'll start a new life, we'll start a family. And it's something that's done over and over and over again. And then the folks are caught in brothels. They're sent all over the city in order to stop them from being familiarized with their surroundings. So we do see raids in those areas. You know, when the folks get picked up, they're terrified. They often, like, immigration it's HSI that does Homeland Security investigations. It's hard for them sometimes to decide who is a trafficker and who's being trafficked. So sometimes we have folks that get, like, you know, I had a client that had criminal charges pushed against her for driving folks from one, to go see the clients. And what immigration couldn't quite see was that this person was actually sort of a victim. So we do see raids, you know, even now. Well, not since the Biden administration, but that's been pretty short. And then they often come to us sort of referred by HSI for us to sort of take care of the case while the prosecution against the traffickers is happening. And you know, I like to call this is sort of, you know, it's a deal that you make. I don't want to call it Clay Faustian, but it's, you know, in order to get immigration status in the United States, a lot of these folks that are picked up have to cooperate in the prosecution of their traffickers. And so, you know, what does that look like? You know, as an attorney, I often have to, like, sit next to them and listen to these law enforcement officers, like, question them. You know, they ask questions like, did this person penetrate you? Like, really invasive questions like that. And so, and, you know, they have to sometimes pick out folks from a lineup, or, you know, sometimes even on a wiretapped call, try to have the person make admissions of trafficking. It's really, really tough. So, you know, those are some of the challenging things that I have with some of the cases that come from raids.
Yeah, wow, that's heavy. You had sent over to me a decision, matter of Ding, and another case in which you had worked on an amicus brief in the matter of RSS. And these implicate the moral turpitude crime exemption from getting legal status. Could you say a little bit about where that work is now?
So I think it's really interesting. When you look at immigration law, you see all these systematic exclusions of people for whom animus has been directed throughout time. Like, if you look at the naturalization form, there's a question like, have you ever been a habitual drunkard, right? And there are all these different categories that, like, even you listen to the language, you're like, who wrote that? What that is that, you know, when there is a sort of a statute, you know, directing animus towards folks, it's really hard to, like, get that out. So sex work is one that is, like, you know, part of that. You know, engaging in prostitution is something that could keep you out of the country, right? If you're at an airport and you somehow get called in for an inspection by Customs and Border Protection, you make admission, they could very well block you out, even if it's legal in your own country. And there is, and that bar of inadmissibility can also block folks who would otherwise be eligible for green cards from getting their green cards. So I think that what's interesting about that RSS case, you know, that amicus brief makes it clear, like, this bar against sex work, it sort of comes from these, like, really old ideas of, you know, sex work is an affront against family. It's some of these same arguments that you heard when DOMA was around, when you know, that this sort of jeopardizes the traditional status of family. You also hear from that brief that there's sort of public disorder arguments against this. This leads to littering. This leads to folks around the neighborhood that I sort of don't want. And, you know, it's sort of our stance at the Sex Workers Project. This isn't quite so much nature of sex work itself, but really the like criminalization that sort of drives it down. There's like a bar called crime involving moral turpitude. Even that like word itself, turpitude, is like real old fashioned. You're like, you know, like trying to explain that to a client, like, what is this word, right? It's something that seems really antiquated, but it's one of the struggles that I have as an immigration lawyer working on these issues is like the contemporary understanding of sex work differs so much from what's written in the statutes. And I think, you know, when you talk about being at the front lines of gender justice, all of, you know, I would imagine that as advocates, you will often encounter statutes, regulations, case law that does not, is not commensurate with the sort of contemporary understandings of, you know, law at this time. So I think that this is a big challenge that I sort of have. So, you know, the clients that I have do sex work, and the Immigration and Nationality Act says that if you do sex work, you're not supposed to get all these benefits, right? You're not supposed to be able to come into the country or get a green card. So one of the things that, you know, I sort of think is really important is trying to navigate my role in trying to change policies that I think are wrong, right? And you know, this often happens. So like clients come in and say, I've done nothing but sex work for 20 years. And, you know, you're staring at this form that has a employment section over there and what you're supposed to write and how you have to write briefs to get folks around that. I think it takes like creative arguments. I think that this is sort of like what I do on a daily basis, being able to make sure I make arguments that like these folks qualify for immigration benefits despite, you know, having had sex work be part of their lives. So in those cases, you know, the crime involving moral turpitude thing is something that I still deal with all the time. The Trump administration like throws back requests for evidence whenever I put an application saying this person is ineligible. And, you know, you literally have to prove in like a paper submission that this person is like worthy of this benefit. So, you know, I find that clients are often feel judged, feel, you know, for a lot of our clients that are LGBTQ particularly, where, I don't know, a lot of our folks that have been rejected by their families and then fled to the United States trying to avoid persecution, having, you know, saying everything that happened and asking for recognition that what happened to you was wrong, only to receive like this paper that says that you are turpitudinous, you lack good moral character, is like an additional harm that the person suffers. So I think that when I read those cases, you know, you see a very formalistic writing of it in a BIA case with precedent, but what you really comes to when you boil it down, I think, is just sort of an antiquated idea that, you know, this is morally wrong in a way that doesn't really jive with modern understandings. Like, you know, this is work like any other kind of work.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting the way you frame it that way, is that the process has a violence built into it, even when it's in a position to say yes, right? And because you have to present yourself in a certain way, I think, and you probably had this issue when you were at Immigration Equality even more, you have to narrate a kind of gay or persecuted identity for asylum claims that may not be anything like where you came from and what your story is.
Yeah. So I have two things to say to that. So there's definitely like a victim narrative that you're supposed to put in order, like you're supposed to put in order to gain the benefit. Like, you know, the statute says you have to prove that you're like a victim of trafficking. But, you know, it's like you said, there's like a form of violence to that. I really like to find small ways to like put in the narrative forms of resistance. So I said this the other day. I had one client that's transgender from Mexico, and in her asylum claim, you know, I had to make her go through every single bad thing that happened to her. But I watched her like eyes light up when she talked about this like blue dress that she hid in a special place in the bushes every time. This was in a detention center too. So like to watch someone's eyes light up while they're in sort of this like concrete jail cell, you know, that's gold. It helps build a connection too. So, you know, it might not have been crucial to the claim from a legal sense, but from sort of human dignity sense and sort of fighting against that victim narrative, describing this blue dress and how she hid it and how she removed her school uniform that she didn't like because she felt it was too masculine, and taking this blue dress and describing exactly how it looked and where she hid it. You know, I try to do those in the narratives that I do. I think it builds connection with the client. I think it gives the client a little bit of a dignity that this process is like a sort of is systematically structured to take the dignity away from that person. And it gives a little color to the application. And, you know, like basically when you're on your immigration court proceedings, you're given like an hour and a half to describe your whole life. It's impossible to do that, and putting in something like that sort of helps a little bit. But you know, I think struggling against that victim narrative definitely is something that you know is part of this work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, there's so many things that you're saying that make me think we should be giving CLE ethics credit for this session, because you know, how do you fill in a form that says, what's your employment been, that isn't asking the client to lie or coaching the client to lie, which of course you can't do, but find some way to match their lives to what the form needs to see.
So one thing that helps with that is that the definition of prostitution is like different across all different statutes and through in the federal definition. So the federal definition calls it promiscuous sexual intercourse for hire, whereas the New York penal law calls it sexual conduct exchanged for anything of value. So this argument works a lot, which you know some folks find surprising, that sexual conduct in New York, it criminalizes a broad variety of stuff. You know, there's you know, like hand jobs, blow jobs. Those are things that are criminalized under the New York statute that aren't criminalized by the federal statute. And so, like, you know, that's something that I will write in a brief. And you know, there's a sort of formalistic sort of idea, oh, you're not supposed to talk about these kinds of things in briefs, but these are issues that actually win sometimes. So I think that one of the things that when doing this kind of work, I have to remember sometimes that like the tribunals that I appear with, they're just really formal, like ritualized ways of having conversation, right? Like there's a judge or there's an adjudicator that throws magic words and says that you're okay. Sometimes I like throw the magic words back at them with, you know, categorical approaches to sort of doing this. But what I'm trying to do really is translate the client's experience in a way that makes sense to this tribunal. I sort of, when immigration judges and adjudicators can sometimes be like mean, they, you know, I had one judge throw a paperclip at me once, and you know, the sort of nature of immigration is you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. One of the things that I really value about being this kind of attorney is that I like to think that I'm sort of a barrier, or like I accept the friction from the system so that the client doesn't have to. Like much better that the judge yell at me than yell at the client. And I find that this works a lot better in immigration court when the client can see that there's a judge that's being awful, or there's like a prosecutor, an ICE attorney that's like being particularly mean. There you can assign like villains to the story. They can see, you know, there's a personification of how unfair the system is. When you're doing all applications just through paper, sometimes the attorney sometimes takes on some of the characteristics of like, you know, you messed up my case, you know, this system's unfair, it's your fault. I think that that's one of the things that I notice the difference between sort of defensive cases and sort of affirmative cases.
That's so interesting. Well, the work you do is tough because you're going to lose a lot of cases that are just heartbreaking, I'm sure.
Yeah, you know, especially when, I was doing immigration detention cases and folks are detained and the judges have, sometimes I have judges that their grant rate is like 2 or 3%. I find that sometimes, when you have to give really bad news, I've had a client once that, she had a, conviction for selling crystal meth, and she was not going to be able to stay in this country. And the lawyer in me wants to be like, here are all the risks, here are all the choices. Okay, we'll move on to the next stage. But in this instance, when there was no next stage, I just really remember she like cried in the the attorney conference room and just said, I don't want to be deported. And I just remember being like, okay, this person actually at this point doesn't need legal counsel. What this person needs is just someone to sit with her. And I think that in this kind of work, with immigration specifically, where it has to do so much with the person's sense of safety, the person's sense of belonging, the person's sense of being accepted, that there's that element of human dignity and human acceptance that which I find really magnetic in this work. But I didn't learn that in law school. I had to sort of learn through sort of experience over the past 10 years in doing that.
Yeah, that's incredible. So we were talking about the immigration context and how a kind of violence towards the so-called beneficiaries of the law is sort of baked into the whole system. I wanted to pivot for just a second to the human trafficking intervention courts in New York, these specialized courts where all sex cases go on the assumption that we just can't sort out the sex workers from the trafficked people. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how those courts work and what kind of critique you have of them, if any.
Sure. So the Human Trafficking Intervention Court is, it was an idea that a lot of the folks that were arrested and charged with prostitution, were not themselves actively committing crimes of their own volition, but rather were victims of human trafficking. What happens is that these folks that get arrested, and a lot of them used to just plead guilty to prostitution or loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And I used to see a lot of folks caught in a dragnet and then put into immigration detention. But with this Human Trafficking Intervention Court, folks are able to appear before a judge, and oftentimes the judge will mandate sort of 5 counseling sessions, with somebody trained with these issues of trafficking. And then if the person does the sessions, then the charges will be dismissed. So very pragmatically, as an immigration attorney, if I divorce myself from sort of the macro issues of this looks good, right? Like the person goes to these 5 sessions and, they don't have this conviction, and then it doesn't adversely affect them for their immigration benefits. A lot of folks, and I think it's a fair criticism, says that this is sort of a overly broad brush that paints everyone as victims. Folks go and then they have to play up this sort of victim mentality, and then they get these charges dismissed. It views sex work not as something that one might do as a fulfilling sort of work to themselves, but rather more of that sort of victim mentality. I think that there's a lot of there's controversy about that. Though pragmatically speaking, the way that folks get put in there though is through in New York City, at least the vice squads or the vice units. And I think that those are something that, I uncontroversially are bad. So, I think a lot of folks think that, if you see it in the news or newspaper, if a cop is an undercover cop, and you ask them if they're a cop, then they have to say it. And if not, the arrest is somewhat invalid, or that there's and that's not true. And, another common misconception is entrapment is a really easy sort of a way to, beat the system, right? If the undercover cop is sort of, asking for a date, then you can sort of beat it if you say, okay, well, this is entrapment. The bar for that is really, really high, such that I almost never see that. And these vice squads, they have like sort of quota that they sort of have to meet, so they're incentivized to make as many arrests as possible. It looks a lot like undercover cops getting into cars with clients and like trying to get them to say the magic words to exchange money for sexual conduct, and then folks get arrested, and they're like a lot of folks try to make the case go as quickly as possible. Folks take disorderly conduct sometimes, or sometimes even looks more egregious than that. I had a client just like last week, and she was telling me about she had an ad up, and then like the NYPD did, like, she describes it as like a sort of battering ram. It like wasn't just knocking on the door; they were like ready to knock down the door with this sort of tool in order to and part of that is causing fear as well. So there's some incongruence with like having this HTIC, Human Trafficking Intervention Court, that's supposed to be understanding of trafficking situations, and having these vice squads be the way that you get into that court. It starts with this sort of violence, and then it has this sort of choreography that's supposed to be a recognition of the person's victimhood. And a lot of times the vice squads will write, oh, we did a trafficking debriefing, but it's really not something that's like really wholesome, but rather it represents like vice squads trying to meet their quotas. And I have some numbers for you. ProPublica says that over the past 4 years, 89% of folks arrested for sex work were people of color, and 93% of folks that were arrested for buying sex were people of color. So there's something the matter with the system where the disparities in the way that this is enforced is so great. Brooklyn a little while ago said that they were going to dismiss, well, they did dismiss warrants in open cases for people with open sex work cases, open prostitution charges. I think that that's a step in the right direction. It's moving toward recognizing like that these kinds of arrests are not only unfair to folks of color, but sort of just like push sex work underground and make it so that folks do sex work in ways that are sort of unsafe and unregulated. So that's the Sex Workers Project. We're moving toward a position. Our position is one of decriminalization.
Great. I know that we've got some questions about that coming in just a moment. So Eric Gonzalez, the DA in Brooklyn, he's been doing this interesting work around dismissing those open warrants, urging Albany to enact even greater vacator laws, dismiss past convictions for lots of people. Are any of the other DAs moving in that direction?
I don't think that. I don't think so. I think that, and honestly, Queens is the place where we see the most sort of enforcement against these folks. I think that, I would love to see that in the other boroughs, but I haven't seen that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we had a big victory though with the repeal of the loitering for the purpose of engaging in prostitution statute, the walking while trans statute, in a way that I don't think was imaginable not that long ago. What do you think are the next possible, not complete dreams, but possible reforms that are coming down the road?
Sure. So the walking while trans, the loitering for the purposes of prostitution, that was a statute under the New York penal law that was like used tremendously against our transgender clients. If you look at the statute, it's like this long, and it has all these things like if you beckon to people, this is something that's interdicted by the statute, and so that's the one that we would most commonly see. I had like tons of clients that just walk into the Duane Reade and would get arrested, or just walking down the street, and so that's something that the repeal of that's something that we really applaud. There are some other like legislation sort of in the works. So there's the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act, which New York State is considering right now, and that would decriminalize and decarcerate the sex trades. What we would really like to see is this decoupling of criminal penalties for these folks. So there's also the START Act. So right now in New York, it's possible to sort of vacate convictions that have to do with trafficking, that were incident trafficking, prostitution convictions, or loitering for the purposes of prostitution. However, we have lots of cases where there are other kinds of convictions that aren't quite sex work. So we have a client that the instant that she stepped off the plane from Ecuador, some men forced her into like a small room in Queens where there was a mattress and she was forced to do commercial sex for months on end. And part of the they call it like seasoning, when the trafficker uses sort of violence against the person, pulls out a gun, beats the person to make the person submissive to whatever the trafficker wants to do. Part of what this trafficker forced this person to do was carry drugs for this person, carry controlled substances on a plane. The person was apprehended by law enforcement, and so she has this criminal conviction, this controlled substance trafficking criminal conviction, that really makes it impossible for her to get any sort of immigration benefits. So she's stuck being undocumented, even though she otherwise would have a pretty strong claim. What the START Act would do would allow her to vacate those two. So I think that's a step in the right direction. Audre Lorde likes to say, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. I think that trafficking, it's really easy to define it in this really narrow terms of forcing people to have sex, but it's really part of this larger thing. Folks, especially with migrant sex workers, we see a lot of folks that, especially with LGBTQ folks, they're rejected by their family, they're persecuted. There's a pull factor to the United States. And then once in the United States, there's all these vulnerabilities that folks have. We have a lot of folks that are 15, 16, 17. They're taken in by somebody who thinks we'll be able to give them housing, employment, and care, and instead they're pulled into these trafficking situations. So I think that these kinds of legislation make it so that there's a more holistic recognition of what these folks' lives are. There's also a movement in Oregon to decriminalize sex work. So Oregon is sort of on the vanguard of these kinds of issues. They decriminalize controlled substances in this way that the idea is to put folks in treatment rather than sort of punish them criminally. So we're trying to we have a real grassroots movement over there and push that forward. So that's what we would like to see both nationally and locally. We're up against a lot of what I talked about before, sort of this older line of thinking. Sex work, when you think about it, the thing that distinguishes it from other kinds of work, there's a deep stigma that carries along with it. It's just one that for thousands of years has existed, and the criminalization element of it. But when you look at jurisdictions where it's been decriminalized, New Zealand is an example, parts of Nevada are an example. It's really something that the decriminalization has really led to regulation of it, from a public health standpoint, and from sort of that public disorder thing that I was speaking about.
Right. I'm going to pass it off to Lauren Chang. Lauren, you've got some great questions for Mr. Lee.
I do, yeah. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak to us. So you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of policies that deny benefits because people were previously sex workers, which one is immoral, and two is sort of implicitly not real work, is I would say the implication. And I was thinking about sex work as sort of, I think of it as being, I would argue that it's protected under the right to work, under Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I was wondering what sorts of labor rights do you think would be most important for sex workers in an ideal future?
You know, the right to unionize would be something that I think would be really progressive. I think that if we just decriminalize sex work, like health risks would be a lot, would decrease a lot. You know, up until recently, condoms could be used as like evidence in criminal prosecutions against folks in New York. So those kinds of rights would happen as well. I think, what are the labor rights? Yeah, I think the right to unionize would be something that we would like to see. But I agree with your statement that sex work should be viewed as any other kind of work. So like the idea should be that the safety nets that are available to other folks that are low income and working should be available to them as well.
You want to keep going, Lauren?
I do, yeah. So you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that I think you said that there's sort of three groups. There's sex workers who, you know, would freely choose it. And there's people who feel that I think this is their best option. And then there's a third group where they feel like, I mean, not that they feel like, they're really being coerced into doing the work. And I was curious about how those interests, from an advocacy standpoint, how the interests of those three groups converge and where they start to diverge.
I think that's a great question. So in presenting those three categories, I think what I didn't say that I think is important is like it's porous as well, right? So this is a very common situation where I have folks in a extremely coercive situation, right? Like, you know, I have somebody who was like locked in a room with a mattress and, you know, the trafficker forced her to have sex and then she escaped her trafficker. But then she voluntarily went and did sex work that, and, you know, she got arrested and we have to sort of explain that. The argument that I have is that it's like incident to trafficking. It's something that because of the trauma and the, you know, that she suffered, this is like sort of a continuation. And I have like therapist notes to do that. I'm doing that because I have a very specific goal in mind that I want to do that victim mentality so that I can get this benefit for folks. But, you know, if you view it from less like an advocacy standpoint and just take a step back and look at it macro, like it can sort of change. But, you know, and I think also one thing that I would say about that is like when the coercion sort of happens, there are vestiges of that like don't go away just because the person escaped, right? Like, so we have one client, so our office is in the Wall Street area, and we have one client that she's unwilling to come to the Wall Street area. The way that she was forced to have sex work were all men in suits. And so when she sees that, it is like a triggering, it is a thing that it stirs up the hyperarousal and the trauma. So that's something that, you know, that stays with her. We have other folks, you know, we have one client that part of the trafficking situation was being compelled to use drugs to keep the person compliant. And now the person is dealing with addiction that, you know, makes the person do sex work. Well, the person chooses to do sex work in order to sort of, because the addiction issues are sort of tough to grapple with. So I think that to answer your question, is like sort of porous. There are things that when the coercion is gone, there's still elements of that are left over that make the person want to do that. One of the things that I hope with, you know, helping folks get immigration benefits, like when a person has work authorization and the person can come out of the shadows, the person has a little bit more agency to make a choice of what they want to do. Some folks, you know, choose to remain in sex work, and the added agency of it is really, I think, is the human dignity part that makes a big difference. So I think that's a really important point.
Great. Why don't you ask one more question, Lauren?
Sure. I'll go big picture because you mentioned this, but how do you see sort of the work you do in New York to advance the rights of sex workers fitting into sort of the larger framework of sex work globally? Like, how do the issues you face here, how are they different than let's say, attorneys and activists in Sweden, where it's decriminalized but not legal, or like you said, in Nevada or New Zealand, where it's legal?
Yeah. So I think that, you know, in big picture type stuff, I really hope that the work that I do is pushing toward a recognition that decriminalizing sex work is a human right, right? Like, I think one thing that I push up against, like, there is pushback against the idea that all people should be allowed to choose consensual adult sex work as a viable work option. Yeah, I really hope that the work that I do helps people understand that, like, some people who need to have a flexible job and it supplements their income and allows them to take care of their basic needs and families, especially now during Corona when the economy is, suffering. A lot of folks don't have work. Having this helps folks, advance their economic rights, and it really can't be fully realized with criminal laws that threaten their access to justice, health, and social services. I think that in the United States, human trafficking is a really big issue, and I hope that the work that I do pushing for recognition and decriminalization of sex work decreases that. I think that from a macro point of view, also decriminalization decreases health risks. Not just STIs, but also like mental health stuff. So if you look at countries where sex work is not criminalized, like the Netherlands, sex work is sort of one of the safest sex options for those who want to explore and experiment with their own sexuality. And if it plays into larger stuff, so there's a sort of conversation about disability rights. Like a lot of folks that are disabled, that having sex work is a way for them to live a full and enriching sex life. That when the sex work is criminalized, it deprives that from folks. And the larger picture about protecting sex workers from police violence and prevent violence and abuse. One of the common themes you hear in the community is once sex work is decriminalized, it takes it from being from underground and allows folks to sort of operate in a way that is more open to the light. And I would stress that sex work looks really different depending on what form folks said. It's a lot of, you watch movies and you just think about street-based work, but there's people putting ads, there's escorts. I have some clients that make way more than I will ever make in my entire life as a public interest attorney. And you have folks that do pornography, you have folks that do dancing. And so there's a wide variety of ways that sex work culminates. And, I think that that's part of the education aspect, right? Like letting folks know that this comes in all different forms.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it off to Callan and then ask other folks to raise their Zoom hands if they've also got questions. So Callan.
Hey, I have so many questions. Thanks for being here. This has been great. One I wanted to start with is I noticed you've been using the language of decriminalization, and I'm wondering, besides just the political realities that decriminalization is easier than legalization, whether you see pros or cons between those as two different strategies for looking at things.
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question. I think so. In my work, I see, decriminalization is taking away the criminal penalties, taking away the the incarceration, taking away fines, taking away that folks. Whereas legalization is sort of building it up as an institution that's sort of legal. I think that from my point, I talk about decriminalization a lot because I really see that that's where the harm lies in a lot of my clients. So I have a lot of clients that come from China and Korea, and when I speak to them, some of the clients view the stigma of being arrested, and that's as the most harmful part. I mean, it's informed by my clients, I think, and that's the part that will make them cry. That's the part that they feel like they've lost face. I think that sort of informs the way that I think about that kind of topic. But yeah, I find that removing the criminal penalties probably will do the most to sort of help the clients that I see in my day-to-day.
Something else I was struck by earlier was when you were talking about some of the changes to the Biden administration about like small things about forms and things like that, beyond just like obviously comprehensive immigration reform needs to happen in Congress. If you're looking at like administrative advocacy right now, are there like small or big things that you think could change either on the local or federal level right now that don't require legislation that you would like to see if you could like wave a magic wand? What does that look like?
There are all these, so when I practiced under the Obama administration, there weren't so many regulatory changes. So these regulatory changes are things that are, you know, like sua sponte motions to reopen and all that. So like, there are things that are really the nuts and bolts of things that I would hope that could change. And also like, under the Obama administration, I used to go to Washington, D.C. and sort of sit down with the folks from ICE and talk about ways in which we could make detention centers better for transgender folks. And, you know, there's controversy about that. Like, are we legitimizing a system if we try to make jails more comfortable? But after the Trump administration came, like, you know, when Jeff Sessions is like sort of the person in charge, and like the point of it is to make immigrants as uncomfortable and be pressured to leave, and there's like less room for advocacy there. I'm interested in seeing what happens moving forward. You know, right now when folks apply for asylum, like there's still the migrant protection protocols where folks, the wait in Mexico policy. I'm hoping that that will you know, go away during this Biden administration. I think you know, during this administration, I think a lot of the immigrant advocates are saying, let's shoot for the moon. Let's ask for everything after like all these 4 years of having such terrible stuff. We don't want to ask for just half of what we want and, you know, settle for a quarter of, you know, is what we get. I think folks are having the bravery to sort of ask for bigger things now. I mean, things that I would love to see. I'd love to get rid of the 1-year filing deadline for asylum. That's something that exists and has like prevented a lot of my clients from being able to present their claims. I mean, when folks that are particular LGBTQ come to the United States, like during their first year, they're not thinking about finding a lawyer and applying for asylum. They're thinking about survival stuff, learning English and making sure that they have enough to meet their daily needs. That's something that I would love to see too. But when it comes to like administrative advocacy, I think that the regulations are definitely something that I would want to sort of change, and like these awful executive orders that the Trump administration put in and doing that. We're seeing some of that, right? Like there's these executive orders that come right away. I worry a little bit that like all the lawsuits that we on the advocacy side did to put preliminary injunctions against them, it's like a double-edged sword that they can use it against us. And we've already started seeing some of that stuff, but that's what I'm sort of watching out for as time goes on.
And I guess a related question to that is, you know, one of the reports that we read that was talking about these trafficking courts, like intervention courts. And, you know, you talked about this mandatory provision of services with the counseling sessions. I was wondering if you had thoughts about either like how that affects trust with your clients, or if there were other things you could change about basically this like nonprofit, like trafficking, like funding apparatus in order to actually be more effective to serve folks. So
a lot of my folks, when they talk to the counselor, you know, therapy is like not something that's generally available to undocumented folks with no medical insurance. And so, you know, I have a lot of clients that like that is something that they value. I have some clients that like treat that person almost like as a surrogate mother or father, and it's like something like a time to actually talk about what folks want. So in those cases, I think that is something that's sort of valuable. And when it comes to like filing immigration applications, that's helpful because I can develop evidence from that. I have other folks that just say, you know, this is something that I have to do. You know, I have folks that have different attitudes about being arrested in general. Nobody likes it, but you know, like I said before, some of my Asian clients, it's like part of the worst thing. And I have other folks that are a little bit more nonchalant about it. Like, this is something that happens to me. This is sort of the assumed risk that I take. You know, and they're sort of glad that there's a way to make their record clean through the HTIC. You know, one of the things that the HTIC does that I like have seen as an improvement, it sort of puts a barrier between the dragnet of being arrested and then being put into immigration detention and being put into removal proceedings. So that's something that I think is a positive benefit.
And then I guess the final piece, and then I'll let him move on to other people, is thinking through, I guess, at the local level. There's so many different elections happening right now in New York for city council and for mayor and for DA races. And do you have things, I know you had mentioned some legislation earlier, but other things that you think are useful for like screening or things we should be asking of candidates like in New York to like actually have there be useful change in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the local district attorneys and the local boroughs, like especially with the DAs, they look to the mayor for sort of like guidance on how to treat these sorts of things. If there were a directive that high up about like, you know, sex work is work and there's a way to distinguish it from human trafficking, if there was like a sort of directive, it's like, we as a city don't think that these folks should be arrested. I think that that would sort of trickle down to the different boroughs. If, you know, if I had to ask a mayor, I would go big and say, stop arresting people on these prostitution-related charges. I think that that would be something that would be really useful to folks. I don't immediately see that as something that's going to happen, but you know, that's my go big sort of ask.
Great. Lauren, thank you for being patient and waiting.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I've learned so much from all that you shared today. A question that I have piggybacks off of Kaylin's question regarding the debate between decriminalization versus legalization. And earlier in the class, we were engaging in that debate, and one of my classmates mentioned that their client who had a foreseeable goal of transitioning out of sex work favored legalization. Which I imagined would open doors for job prospects and potentially create more eligibility for documented immigration status. However, given that legalization also comes with the aspect of governmental regulation, which could potentially create, you know, other manifestations of criminalization, have you noticed whether certain clients who may be looking to transition out of sex work prefer or advocate for legalization, while those who may be or who may seek to continue to do sex work prefer decriminalization? Have you noticed if there's like a kind of a timeline preference there? I know you talked about the cultural distinctions, but I'm just curious about that as well.
I think that's interesting. I think a lot of my clients, because of just the nature in which I'm representing them, like lack sort of understandings of like the big picture type things. Like what my clients understand is like, you know, I go do sex work, these people, these undercover cops come and knock down my door and handcuff me and bring me to court. It would be great if that didn't happen. And I think that, you know, that deep stigma that I was talking about earlier that's attached with sex work, it's often in my clients themselves. Like I often have clients that are like, you know, I know what I'm doing is illegal. And some folks are like, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I do it anyway because of my circumstances. I think that it's a lot easier for my clients to imagine the decriminalization. Like this bad thing that's happened to me is going to go away. That would be great. I got a lot of calls after the Brooklyn DA announcement of like, how does this affect me? Does that mean that I can do this in Brooklyn and do sex work and I won't face these sort of things? I think a lot of folks, that's why I talk about decriminalization, because that's the sort of way that my clients can imagine that. I think that part of the education, though, would be creating sort of a broader understanding of the legalization type way. I mean, I think it's a really important conversation to have. I think when I talk to my clients in particular, that are folks that are coming to us for free legal services, that the harm is in the getting arrested, getting handcuffed, going to court, having a rap sheet that looks like this for consensual sex work. So I think that when it comes to pragmatically, the clients lean that way.
Thank you. Sonia.
Clement, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It was very, very helpful. And I particularly was moved when you shared, how you allow for space in your advocacy for human dignity. Every human being caught in this carceral system of ours has at least one blue dress story. And I think I really appreciated you sharing that. I actually had two questions. One had to do with prospects of legislative changes, particularly to visas such as the T visa and U visa. And the fact that they're both dependent on this notion of requirement of cooperation with a criminal prosecution. And beyond the fact that there is an irony, a sad irony to the fact that they're designed to end exploitation, and yet they're dependent on the use that the government can get and the utility that the government can get from these intended beneficiaries. Beyond that irony, it seems so far removed from the ground reality that these people face and the threats that they have. So I'm curious what you think are the prospects of changing that element of these visa processes. The other thing that I'm curious about is how in your work, how you see support from other immigration, especially amnesty, refugee-based claims. There is so little mercy and there's so little relief in this entire area. And I'm wondering, for example, every time there's a petition made for example, for asylum, and they begin with characterization of their client as someone of good moral standing, someone who has never engaged in sex work, that somehow reinforces the stigma that your clients have to begin with. So how do you lobby for that kind of wholesale support from this entire immigration reform collective?
Sure. Great. Thanks for that question. So a couple of things. The blue dress story, I find that that's just one example of ways in which you can build resistance into a system that is based on victimhood. I try a couple of tactics with this, especially with trafficking victims, or trafficking survivors. You see a lot of folks sometimes that become overly reliant on attorneys. Like the agency had been taken away from them and taken by this person, and it makes sense to give it back to this attorney, especially when the immigration system is so hard to understand. So I try to make do some things to build sort of resistance and make the person have their own agency. I tell folks what happened to you was wrong, and by writing this and by going through this, we're closing the book or closing the chapter on a bad chapter in your life and opening up a new one. I try to make sure that I write out choices for what the client can do. 3 seems to be the magic number of choices. When you do 2, it seems like the clients are concerned that, oh my God, I picked the wrong one. If you do 4, it becomes kind of overwhelming. So I try to do things like that to make sure that clients have agency. When you talk about prospects for TVs to change, so the very technical answer is because T visas are built into a statute, and Congress is the body that is purposed with making these kinds of change. In order for that to change, you would have to have Congress be able to actually pass laws, which the entire time that I've been an attorney, I almost barely think of Congress as being able to pass immigration laws, even though they have plenary power to do so. So I think that's the really technical answer, but I think that when I started as an immigration lawyer, I had this misconception that you know, from a civil rights standpoint, like we start out really unfair and like things gradually increase until we get fairer and fairer and fairer until we reach like a summit where everything will be fair. I mean, I think that that was like a really mistaken sophomoric sort of point of view that I had. I think that when it comes to DDs, is there any kind of reform, you know, especially with something so politically charged as immigration, it's sort of a pendulum of like where the sort of country's feeling about immigration is right now. I think that people's feelings about immigration have to do with how well the economy is doing. I think it has to do with, you know, if an administration is pushing forward sort of xenophobic sort of views. If there is to be sort of change, I think that like, I will feel optimistic about it when the sort of pendulum switches back to like a more balanced view of like who immigrants are and how they help folks. You know, so I think that what I would say is that when there's a sort of more balanced view, which there certainly is not right now, maybe there will be like more of a chance to sort of, you know, reframe folks being able to live in this country from just this very particular subset of victims to like sort of a bigger contingent, you know, and there's precedent for this before, right? Like when Ronald Reagan was president, you know, there was amnesty. It wasn't so controversial then, right? Like there are folks that if you could prove your it being in the United States since a certain date in the 80s, and you could prove that, you could be able to obtain lawful status in the United States. So I think that it's possible, but I think that because immigration is such a charged issue politically, I think what you would need to do is make sure that it's balanced this way. But I tend to be kind of pessimistic about this. Like the folks in my office saw that and like, yeah, we're going to be doing these from now on. So, you know, you could have different sorts of points of view about that. So I think that that question has like a technical answer and then like a sort of big picture answer. And the last thing you said, I think, yeah, the entire time, with the good moral character and, you know, these like sort of antiquated terms, there is a binary between like good immigrant and bad immigrant. Like even during the Obama administration, you said like, we're deporting convicts and we're keeping families together, right? Like that's a sellable type message. And I think one of the harms that results from that kind of messaging is exactly what you said, right? Like there is a vilification of one group and sort of like a lionization of another group. And, you know, I think that one of the things that, you know, would be on my wish list is sort of viewing folks as like more human beings. There's a lot of statutes that like, you know, if you commit an aggravated felony, the immigration judge doesn't even have any choice to keep you in this country, like you're immediately deportable. That idea of like restoring sort of discretion to judges to let people stay in this country, I think would be a good thing. But apart from a very attorney-based, like legalistic sort of view, that good immigrant, bad immigrant binary is one that exists very much in the system. And, you know, you even hear it from immigrants that, you know, have come to the United States and have gotten green cards or citizens, right? Like I'm allowed to stay here because I'm good, and like those folks should be removed because they're bad, right? Like it's a thing that's so ingrained into the system that it becomes internalized into the folks that we see. And the problem with that is the bad immigrant category gets like broader and broader, right? Like we saw like there was the public charge rule where folks that were likely to use benefits were face a barrier from being able to stay in this country lawfully. It made a lot of folks that otherwise qualified like not want to take them for fear of being categorized as like the bad immigrant. So I think that one of the things I would hope that comprehensive immigration reform would do would like give it a perspective that's a little bit more human and less like, you know, check, 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 bad, check, 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 good. But I think that maybe that's, you know, not realistic for now. I mean, you know, that's one of the fundamental sort of tough things about, you know, being an immigration lawyer, right? Like on the one hand, you're trying to present a person as like a holistic, whole human being. On the other hand, you're a lawyer, which deals with barriers and deals with like, you know, lines in the sand. And if you check this and check this. So I find that sort of a cool part about immigration, trying to navigate those two things. But I think what you said about the good immigrant, bad immigrant divide is like really important.
Never mind the mediocre immigrant. I mean, why shouldn't people coming to the country be able to be as mediocre as most of us are? Paige, please.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. I had a question. This past summer, I kind of got a primer on immigration law, and I worked on like 1.5 T visas. So I've just barely scratched the surface of like what that work looks like. But it kind of seemed like there was pushback from the government and like USCIS at every single step of the way. I was curious to hear if you feel like was more pushback due to the Trump administration, and if you have any anticipation that, I know you're not really that optimistic that the statutory law will change, but that maybe just the government will facilitate the process somewhat and make it easier and faster to actually get positive T visa outcomes.
Yeah, your observation, I agree with 100%. Like during the Obama administration, when we put in T visas, they were sort of ways to get status that seemed, you know, I don't want to say they're easier, but we got less pushback than maybe some of the other things, asylum, U visas. During the Trump administration, you know, you put in an application and they slap you with an RFE, a request for evidence, saying prove that you have good moral character, prove that you deserve discretionary relief, show us your taxes, show us your arrest reports, show us all these things. I think part of it was a deliberate, like they didn't want to give these T visas, and they're not allowed to just not give them. So you could do a writ of mandamus if they were just not giving them. So the way that they did it was just like adding all these extra steps. So there was a lot of pushback for those. We're only like a month into the Biden administration. And so this is the thing that I'm wondering now. So like the Trump administration asked for all these arrest reports, and we have all these cases where those are still pending. My new sort of question is like, do we give these arrest reports? And like, the thinking might be, yes, new administration, but they're bound procedurally by the old cases. And so like we'll follow that sort of logic. Or is it like, don't give them things because it's going to give them a reason to deny that they wouldn't otherwise have? I sort of am, I don't know, I am sort of optimistic that the enforcement of immigration will become, if not more fair, but a little bit more predictable. And so I do think that pushback that we have, and we call it pushback. I think that, if you look at it from a legal standpoint, yes, they're pointing particular regulations to justify why this pushback is. But if you take a step back, it's very much like, we don't want immigrants in this country, and here are the mechanisms at our disposal to make the number of T visa grants less. So one of the things that I've had to practice for the past 4 years is looking at things with like a microscope and taking that with like a big scope. If you just look at this request for evidence, you're like, oh, they want item exhibit 1, 2, and 3. We can give it to them. But then if you take a step back, you're like, oh, this is actually a mechanism to which to deny the claim. So to answer your question, I think I'm hoping that, I think the word I want to use is like fair, that like so folks will have a fair shot at this, and that like there will be less pushback for these kinds of things. But with the regulations, they were changing all the time. Like my legal team would sit at our legal meeting every week and try to predict things that would happen in the future that like we would have no idea of what would happen. And I think that was like probably the hardest part, like trying to like predict like ways in which the entire system would shift seismically and not even know what happened. So I do think that under a new administration, like maybe we'll get less pushback.
Thank you.
Natalie.
Hi, actually, Anivesh has had his hand up for a while, so do you want to ask your question first? Oh, okay, all right.
I've been going back and forth in the chat, so he'll come next.
Sure. Thank you so much, Clement, for being here with us today. I really appreciate your insights. I have a question about consent, because sex work involves sexual activity, so it engages with the legal definition of consent. And while human autonomy is so important and should inform this definition of consent, this also has to be weighed against, the presence of coercion, which has been viewed as presumptively, almost conclusively at sometimes negating consent. So do you think a reconceptualization of consent in accordance with the lived realities of sex workers and their experiences is necessary, along with decriminalization, which you talked about?
I think that's a really important question, right? Like, sex work is like sort of a slogan that you sort of hear in this, but because sex work has this particular element of like bodily integrity, there's an extra element where it makes the consent more important, right? Like, if take a fisherman, for example, if a person like fishes against their will, there's not that added element of sort of bodily integrity that we sort of view as, being fundamental to a person's sense of self, right? And so I think that that's really important. So I said before, like choice, circumstance, and coercion. I think, that artificially sometimes makes it seem like those are three really separate categories, but the consent is really important, and especially in the ones where folks are there by circumstance. Like, what does the consent sort of look like? Do you want folks to like sign a contract? Is that how you really mark consent? Does it look more like the ways that we talk about, when there's cases of sexual assault and rape, and it's sort of that ground where it gets litigated, and it's sort of a thing that can get kind of murky. I think if your question is about reconceptualization of consent, I think that there's, for consent and for work, there's like a meeting of the minds, and that both folks want the sort of same thing. I think it is possible to sort of have a way in which consent is like formalized for work, but I think what you're saying is right. Like, it gets kind of murky in these kinds of situations. I think my goal as like an attorney is to give the clients whatever tools I have at my disposal and the law allows them to increase their agency, right? Like, if somebody is an undocumented sex worker that's under the control of a trafficker, that person will have more agency and more ability to consent if the person is sort of freed from those kinds of things. But, I think that because consent has to do with like human autonomy and something that you have in your mind, you're like not going to get to that 100% no matter what, because, it's the single issue struggle thing. There's 10,000 things affecting the person's autonomy. But I do think that when we do have systems that give people legal rights and healthcare and economic rights, that's the best way to ensure that the person has the most agency to obtain whatever consent that they need.
Thank you. Anivesh, you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the talk. As in, my question is a little abstract. As in, I'm currently in Amsterdam, where like sex work is legal, and also like there are quite strong worker unions for like sex workers, but there are still like many cases of trafficking, and especially through lover boys, as they call them, like people who just seduce these women from Eastern European countries or like refugee population, and then they get them into sex work. So as in, and also like if you ever cross the red light district, you see them like being displayed through these glass windows. So there's this question of objectification, but like keeping that aside, as in when like, even if we look at legalization debate versus decriminalization, who do we target in our heads? Like people who feel that they have a right to work, or like there's this population who will be violated or like trafficked through this. So like while debating that whether it should be legalized, decriminalized, as in like who should we target, or like we as a system and a society are equipped enough to segregate, like while making it legalized, we can protect these trafficked women. Like how do we like argue or like question this?
Yeah, that's something that I hear a lot, right? That if we create legalization, then it will just create a formalized way in which folks will be exploited. I sort of think that, this goes back to the last question about consent, right? I think it's possible to have two separate categories of consensual sex work and trafficking, and draw a real line there, right? Like, even though there are cases where that it sort of becomes kind of porous, I think that there is a sort of line of autonomy that really separates the two. So when you talk about your example in the Netherlands, and there's people who are trafficked from, or if not trafficked, then sort of exploited, that come from the sort of lower economic sort of classes. I think it's possible to have a system where you create either legalization or decriminalization that doesn't solve all the problems, but just doesn't have it so underground. Who to target? I think that the idea of decriminalizing, from a policy standpoint, is taking away these harmful sort of penalties from it, and from that will flow like a system that makes some more sense. You see it in New Zealand, and you see it in the Netherlands too, that like this idea, if you legalize it, that like harm will flow out of it. That doesn't really come to fruition. But I completely understand what you're saying. Like, I think that in any kind of work context, there are folks that come from maybe more economically disadvantaged situations that get exploited. I think that legalization or decriminalization doesn't solve all of those. Like, people who are sex workers still participate in a capitalist economy where folks are valued as much as their labor is, but it just gives them some more options. So that's a sort of vague answer, but I think that I don't know that I can say we're targeting this person, but I do think that decriminalization and legalization will make it so that the harm flows less towards these folks.
Thank you. Rosario, last question.
My question is, well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. It was very interesting hearing you. And my question is very quick. So first of all, I come from a country where sex work is decriminalized. So for me, the whole concept of criminalizing sex work is very alien to me. And my question is, first of all, regarding New York penal law, what type of conducts are mostly prosecuted under this concept of sexual conduct? And is the prosecution of prostitutes the same or proportional as the ones of clients, or are prostitutes mostly the ones being criminalized and convicted for these crimes?
That's a really good question. So like I said before, about 89% of folks arrested for sex work in New York are people of color. And the arrests that I see the most, they're not the high, like Elliot Spitzer type escorts that are charging lots of money. It's folks that are doing street-based work. It's a lot of folks that are, there's a lot of LGBTQ folks, there's a lot of transgender folks, there's a lot of people of color. And so like the same sort of problems that you see, with the over-criminalization in the United States, if you just go, if you were an alien landing down from Mars and you went to a prison, you would think that only Black people get arrested in the United States. I think that that's like a sort of similar pattern of that you see with sex work in the United States. So, so that's like called the Nordic model, when folks, the folks that are criminalized or punished are the people buying the criminal sex work rather than the people who are providing it. In New York City, the people who are providing it are arrested at a much higher rate, but you do see both. I think, in sort of my opinion, the idea of like, okay, we don't punish these folks, we punish these folks, just steps away from the idea of decriminalization, which I think is kind of the optimal sort of idea. But yeah, the folks that so I have clients that do street-based work, and the folks that have 8, 9, 10, 12, 16 arrests, and then I have other folks that sort of operate at a higher socioeconomic level and they don't have any arrests. So like there is a real asymmetry to the way that folks are arrested. And like that's, I think, is another argument for decriminalization, right? If these laws are being enforced in such like an obviously asymmetric way, right? Like it's not like the idea of like you punish crimes to sort of have a deterrent effect, like that's gone. You punish crimes to sort of have a retribution sort of like that. It's not working. It's just sort of punishing this very specific folks and people who are already vulnerable. So I think that question, the answer leads to like the natural syllogism of like being that decriminalization makes sense.
Thank you. Clement, can students work as interns or do summer work with the Sex Workers Project? And if so, how would they apply? Yeah,
please, yes. So internships at the Sex Workers Project looks a lot like getting assigned a client to work with. Immigration law allows law students to represent clients if they're under supervision of an attorney. So, you have a lot of agency over the case. You can sort of take it the way you want. You get a lot of supervision. And, I think the richest part is developing this like relationship with this person and being able to sort of develop a case that way. So if you are interested in doing asylum or TVisa cases, feel free to send me a cover letter and a resume. I'm typing my email address in the chat window, and I'm welcome to it. During COVID, the internship will look different than it has traditionally. Maybe by summer it will look back to what it used to look like, but this is something that I'm negotiable. But yes, definitely, if anyone has interest, please, I welcome resumes and cover letters.
Great. Thank you so much. You've spent so much time with us this afternoon, and the work is just so important. And I just am so moved by the subtlety that you bring to thinking about how to do this work in a system that you fundamentally disapprove of. And I think it's just an incredibly valuable model for us to think about how to be an ethical person, a person who respects human dignity when the framework of the work is so challenging. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been really enriching. Thank you so much for your questions and your attention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Clement. I'm going to let you go, and I bet you're going to get some applications from students, because it's just, the work is great. So thank you.
I welcome them. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.